When difficulties in life come our way, when we experience a loss, sometimes it sets us back and we just don't know how to process it and move forward again. We can sometimes just end up stuck. Today's guests join us from Indiana. Chuck Elliott is a pastor at Bethel Church in Evansville, and Ashley Elliott is a licensed counselor. Together, they have authored the book, I Used to Be, How to Navigate Large and Small Losses in Life and Find Your Path Forward. Chuck and Ashley, it's great to have you on today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. We're looking forward to this.
Yeah, it's an honor.
Yeah, me too. I'm looking forward to this. So, can you tell us a little bit about your story and why you decided to write I Used to Be?
Yeah, part of our story is we faced recurrent miscarriage in 2015, 16, and 17. We lost little ones, and through that process and understanding how we process loss differently, maybe there were some things in our life that we weren't recognizing as grief and losses that needed to get processed. And through working through my job and the church and being with people during their losses, and Ashley as a professional counselor, we saw that there was something that we could speak into this process and help people to recognize it. And in our book, we do share about our story and different aspects of that, but it's really in an effort to coach people where they are and how it is that they fill in the blank for I used to be.
And the book isn't just about miscarriage or anything. It is about any sort of way that the person might fill in that blank. I used to be married or pregnant or employed, any sort of loss that the person has experienced. And so we give people permission to grieve those traditional losses due to like death,
Mm.
but then also those smaller issues. Sometimes they can compound. And we can even learn a lot about them, even if they haven't compounded, because then if we gain healthier coping skills and we build mental stability, then we are able to thrive whenever we have something that might be even a little bit bigger that happens down the road.
That's amazing that you write about job loss as a form of grief because a lot of people are married to their jobs. And if they were laid off or they lost their job or the company went under, it can be a huge loss for them. Now, in times of grief, we want to hear God's comforting voice, but sometimes he just seems silent. How should we handle this, and what has your experience been?
For us, we definitely experienced some different things with our relationship with God through different losses. But with our very first loss, we were in the ER, our first miscarriage, and we turned on worship music and we said, Lord, we bring you to this moment. We're very sad, but we need your help. We want you in it. The second loss, we waited about a whole year to try again. And it was the same time of the year, actually, this season of the year, several years ago. It was 2015, 16, and 17. And so 2016, we just were hit with different emotions. I especially felt just so much more sad in a deep way that like this is what's going to be the rest of my future. Like we may never have another child, and so the first time it happened I thought maybe this does happen to a lot of people, but we just coped, and I felt distant from God. I tried. I mean, we were still doing ministry. We were praying. I was leading. I taught at a university for 11 years, and so I'm still going to work every day, mentoring students, and yet I just felt like I'm going through and trying to continue doing the things, but I just feel like God's very quiet or distant. And so one of the things that I prayed in my tearful moment is, Lord, like I haven't turned away from you in this. I'm not even like shaking my fist at you, but where are you? And so I went to scripture and I said, what have other people done? And I've always loved the story of Job. And what I see with Job, like we kind of get this like backseat view, like the enemy is trying to devour Job and God is allowing it, which can be hard, was always hard for me as I went through the story. But I also saw that I want to be like Job. I didn't want to be like his wife who said, curse God and die. Like I want to be faithful. And I admired his faithfulness that even whenever God wasn't jumping in and rescuing him, that he was faithful. And so I continued to see some of the words of David in the Psalms and some different people who struggled. And I thought, I want to be gritty. I want to be faithful, even though it's difficult. And in time, I began to feel more of God's presence. And I realized like it might have been a little bit more me, that it wasn't God that had pulled away from me. I just felt like there was a block, a grief block, or something that kept me from feeling like I could connect with God like I had previously done so.
And we've seen many times when people go through a loss, ourselves included, our perspective on who God is might shift. and it might shift in an inappropriate way and an incorrect way.
Mm.
You might find him to be more loving and more true and more reliable, but you also might think that he's distant, doesn't care, and he's punishing you. But when we read the scriptures, it corrects us.
Mhm.
So that's part of the beautiful thing about when you stay in God's word. You learn more about him, you learn about his character. And when you have something about you that's getting off track and it could maybe go in a negative way, his word brings you back to what's true.
Now, what are some common ways grief lies to us, and how can we recognize the lies and overcome them?
Mm. One of the biggest ones is grief lies and tells us that we're alone, that you're alone, that nobody's felt this before, even that you deserve this,
Mm.
that you've done something wrong because you should be punished. And that's why you're losing the person, the situation, the job, the relationship that you had. That's one of the big ones. It also tells us that nobody could understand. That there's no way that anybody could understand. Nobody wants to hear my pain. Because if I was to ask you, if somebody was going through a really hard time, could they talk to you about it? You would likely say yes. But many times we think that if we were to ask somebody else to be there for us and just to listen and just to be a shoulder to cry on, somebody to go out to dinner with, somebody to go on a walk with, somebody just to listen, we think that they'll say no. And that's another one of the lies that we really see people believing, and it causes them to isolate. And isolation is not the key to getting better.
Yeah, one of those lies is to isolate. They say, "Oh, isolation is going to be the ticket through
Mm.
this." And even for us, whenever we were going through our loss, I didn't physically isolate as much as I emotionally isolated. And as I've talked to others and worked with people through counseling, I see that people will often isolate either emotionally or physically as a way to cope. And so we encourage people. You can even grab a piece of paper, the notes section of your phone, and list what are my positive coping mechanisms, the things that are good and bring health and healing, and what are those negative coping
Mhm.
mechanisms. And sometimes that is a wall that we put up. We isolate to protect ourselves from being hurt again. And so for that reason, I would put it oftentimes in the negative coping.
Mhm.
Now the tricky part is all of the good things can have some negative sides, and all of the negatives can have some good side because we do bad things even for good reasons. And so we help people look at the function and the dysfunction. What is that good in that bad thing? So if someone is isolating or they're telling themselves that no one cares, we can look at the good in that. We do that to protect ourselves.
Mm.
And if you are feeling alone or feeling that no one's around or nobody cares, you use something called switch theory. And so, can you unpack that for us and explain how it applies to navigating through grief?
Yeah.
Anytime we go through a hard time, we can feel a little bit different. We might find ourselves navigating toward what we call a negative space. So we start off relationships oftentimes in a positive space with positive thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. We feel good and we are joyful. And so then we act in a happy way or a kind way.
Mhm.
But eventually we face some unmet expectations and we shift toward a negative space.
Yeah, and in that negative space, you have negative thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and none of us want to be there. But what do? Do you communicate when you're in one of these spaces about your unmet expectations, or do you stay silent? Do you stay silent in a positive space and just think, okay, I'm going to be able to get through this? It was an unmet expectation. But what we find in our counseling and coaching, and even working with businesses, is many times people have negative thoughts and feelings, but they go uncommunicated. And when they go uncommunicated for too long, that's when you have a higher likelihood that someone's going to leave, someone's going to check out emotionally, physically. Affairs happen, higher turnover in businesses.
Yeah, so there's an apathy that kind of breeds itself in this negative space. There's that isolation, like no one understands. Well, then we don't tell, and then we perpetuate that
Mm.
cycle. And so, one of the tools that we use in our work is we help people to begin to be familiar with their positive and their negative space. So, we have patterns, we have things that we might say over and over again. And so, if you learn, when I'm in a negative space, I tend to say, no one cares about me. We can go, oh, there's that thing. There's that pattern thought highlight I'm in a negative space. Now that can seem really simple. We're like, duh, I know I'm in a grouchy mood.
Mhm.
But if we see it as a little bit more that we've been thrust into this space, we say, no, 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 no. I want to fight for that positive space. I want to do something. I want to bring God into that negative space, which is something people struggle with. They oftentimes want to fix themselves up, get all prettied up, and then they bring God into their life. And so whenever we feel shameful, we may want to like leave God out of it until we've gotten our lives fixed. So we can bring God into it. Maybe it's getting into nature, doing something that helps us feel a little bit better. We get that front part of our brain activated again where we can think rationally, and then we can start to think about what are those positive thoughts? What, and we don't just mean like rainbows and butterflies, but a thought of like no one cares about me is maybe something in a negative space. And so in that positive space, we say, I know that they care about me, but we need to talk about this, right? So we're not trying to just say, everything's great and I'm not going to deal with anything. But oftentimes that negative space tells us, run away, cut the ties, make everything bad. And really, we want to help kind of pull toward this positive space where we say, let's set up an appointment to talk, or let's get in nature, or go to a worship service or something that will help us, focus on God and bring ourselves back toward that positive space.
That made me also think about when I work with men for sexual integrity coaching. Many times, when they're in a negative space and they don't feel as hopeful, is when they're more likely to do something they're not as proud of,
Hmm.
whether that be looking at something inappropriate or be tempted to have an inappropriate conversation with someone when they're married or that area. When you have those uncommunicated negative space thoughts, they're more likely to come out in a symptom that is really going to damage your life. So we help people to get underneath those things and prevent those things.
Now, Ashley, as a licensed counselor, you've helped a lot of people deal with losses. Just before we got going on this interview, I was telling you how I lost my father in 2003 and then my mother in 2020. And both times as soon as I heard the news, I was extremely focused on what needed to get done. I got very task oriented. I worked with all the family on the funeral arrangements and just worked with everyone really well. And I was at a really peak productivity at that time. But then 4 months later, the reality set in that these people are gone. And that's when I went through my grief. So what can you do what advice do you have to support those who deal with this delayed reaction?
Yeah. Well, first, I'm so sorry for your losses, and I really appreciate you being willing to talk about it.
Yes.
And there's a lot of people who actually say that that's the worst part, that they get through the first couple of days, the first couple of weeks, and sometimes even the first few months.
Mhm.
But there's often a time where it comes and it hits them. And so whoever faces the time, at whatever pace, it's okay. You can accept that as part of your journey. Like we don't always know when we're going to be hit with it, but when we do, that we give ourselves permission to try to work on it, to say, I am worth the investment to give myself space to process. If that means taking a day off work and meeting a counselor or taking a time out in nature to have some extra extended time with the Lord to process and heal, there is hope and healing that comes just from even giving ourselves space. So it doesn't even have to be as formal as we think that it might need to be. But again, it comes at different times for different people.
And I think allowing yourself, not just I think, I know that allowing yourself to feel it when you need to feel it. I write about this in the book a little bit. We live close to the hospital where we lost our little ones. And will sometimes go for a run in the mornings. And it was early one morning, and I was going for a run, and I was running around the hospital. And while I was doing that, I started to feel myself get emotional. And I knew that I had a choice. I had a choice of whether or not I'm going to allow myself to feel this in this moment, or I'm just going to stuff it down and keep running. And what I chose to do was I allowed myself to feel it. I started to tear up and I was still running. I started to cry a little bit more and I slowed down until I started sobbing. And I was just standing in front of the hospital and I was sobbing. And that's not the look that I was necessarily going for, but it's what I needed to do in that moment to grieve and recognize that my life is different because we don't have these little ones that we expected to have. And I'm often reminded of that moment when I could be tempted to push through and ignore what it is that I'm feeling. And what if I communicated to God? What if I communicated and recognized that I was feeling something that felt off and I needed to talk about it, pray about it, talk to Ashley about it, talk to somebody else? And it feels weak to stop and do something like that, but I know that I was stronger and became stronger, and I'm stronger now because I allowed myself to do that, and I can have conversations like this with you today.
Chuck and Ashley Elliott are the authors of I Used to Be: How to Navigate Large and Small Losses in Life and Find Your Path Forward. Chuck and Ashley, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
I'm Naveen Day on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks for watching.